I really appreciate you tuning in. And today we've got a panel, including myself, Victor Marengo, a head of software solutions at PBTech, Liam Buttner from Ingram Micro, who is a Microsoft Modern Workplace specialist, and our very own genius, Craig Galloway, who's an Azure solutions architect. So the purpose of today is we wanted to run through some changes that are happening in the New Zealand market around Azure Virtual Desktop. And as you know, we've gone through some transitions over the last sort of 40 years of computing, back from the old mainframe days, and then along came a company called Citrix, who really took shared desktop computing to the next level back sort of 20 years ago. Microsoft have jumped on board with that back in the terminal server days, and now with remote desktop. And continue to work very closely with Citrix, and now they have released Azure Virtual Desktop. That's been a product that has been around for 5 years or so now, but the change in New Zealand, of course, is with Microsoft coming to New Zealand in the data centre in West Auckland. It's going to mean a much greater availability of the product for Kiwis and much lower latency, and there's a whole lot of benefits to be able to utilise that. Along with that, there has been some significant maturity of the product, which we'll go through in today's session, that really starts to utilise the ability for published applications and so forth, which is really going to be beneficial to a lot of Kiwi businesses. So without further ado, our agenda for the day is going to be a 45-minute session, so it's just during your lunch break. We're going to be covering the Microsoft licensing program and some updates there, the cloud licensing changes, and then we're going to go over the whys. You know, why would you use AVD? Why would you utilize it for your business, and why is it going to be great, or why isn't it going to be great? From there, we'll just have a little pause. And then I will invite you to stay on for a very technical session about the migration strategies and best practices in migration path from RDS to AVD. So that will be a technical component to the session at the end, so the last 20 minutes or so. Now, Victor, would you like to jump in here and take over the next piece?
Thank you, Rodney. Thanks, everybody, for joining in today. It'll be a pretty quick one for me today. I just wanted to reinforce something that we communicated to, I think, most of you on this call today, which are the program changes from Microsoft. We've been talking about this in the past year or so. The CSP is going legacy, getting replaced by the New Commerce Experience, short for NCE. And those changes bring quite a bit of changes actually to the way you license Microsoft services. So Microsoft about a month or two ago announced that they're going to be officially phasing out CSP from January 2024. Now that's valid to all clients, including education entities, charities, and non-for-profit, and obviously commercial clients. So if you haven't got your head around the changes, if you are not on the new program already, we encourage you to engage with us so we can work it out a plan and minimize any disruptions or any changes that might affect you negatively with a plan under the new program, right? So that's basically it. I just want to reinforce the message. We're also working on another session similar to this one on Microsoft Copilot. So for who doesn't know Microsoft Copilot, I like to use ChatGPT as a reference, but Microsoft Copilot will be much more than that. So it's the AI generative product from Microsoft. It's going to be embedded on the operating system. So that means if you are licensed to use, that's going to be a Microsoft native product that will have plugins and pre-integrations across Outlook, SharePoint, Teams, and all the Microsoft applications. So it could be a game changer, and in my opinion, it's going to change the landscape on how we work, having direct access to a AI tool that can scan internally private information as well as public, which is what GPT does, which is on the public side, right? So we expect to have more information around the licensing of this program. Microsoft 365 Copilot is due for official release from the 1st of November. We have some information around pricing, but we will work on this material, mature a little bit more the presentation, and put something together so we can give everybody an update on how Microsoft Copilot is going to work, what it means for you as a business, and how much it's going to cost. So we'll try to do that before the end of the year, but we'll keep you all informed on that matter as well. So I'll hand it over to Liam now.
Awesome.
Thanks, Victor.
Thank you, Victor. Hey everybody, thanks for jumping in today. My name's Liam and I look after the Modern Workplace portfolio at Ingram Micro. So a couple of components I want to go through today around the licensing side of Azure Virtual Desktop. So a really easy way to look at AVD and how to license it is it's sort of broken into two parts. So the first component of AVD licensing is the actual user access rights. So having the rights to actually access the environment, and there's two, I guess, primary ways that you can do this. And the first and the most common is the licensing entitlement via subscription or CSP or NCE subscription. So many that are already on Microsoft Cloud products using M365, Business Premium, F3, E3, and E5, you will have access rights to Azure Virtual Desktop environments. And that tends to be the most cost-effective way to do it. There are add-ons that you can use for that, like a Windows 10/11 E3 license also, but most of the time the cost effectiveness comes from the base license you're probably already using. It is important to note as well that if you are running one of those Windows Server host sessions in AVD, you will need the Windows Server CALs if you don't have software assurance or hybrid benefits. And even if you're migrating from that RDS as it is, current users wanting to log into that operating software do still require those Windows Server CALs. So just be aware of that, because obviously that is slightly different to the access rights. From there, the second option is quite a new option from Microsoft, which gives the option to purchase under your Azure subscription a monthly per user price for external users. And that is something that we haven't seen a huge amount in customers' environments as of yet, but it just gives another option to obviously license your access to that environment. Next slide, please, Rodney. And so the second component of an AVD environment in regards to licensing is the actual Azure infrastructure license itself. So the Azure NCE subscription. So you obviously need to spin up an Azure account and subscription to actually allow the deployment and management of that virtualized environment. And that's for everything, obviously, from your virtual machines, operating software storage, data disks, and of course, user profiles. So those are the two components that always need to be licensed in an AVD environment. And then again, just reiterating the point, if it's a Windows Server host session in there, just make sure that, of course, you've got those Windows Server CALs as well, because we do need to make sure that it's licensed to be compliant with Microsoft, as they don't always enforce a lot of the CAL rules, but they do need to be sitting on the tenant, of course. And that's my part from the licensing side. I'll hand back over to Craig, please.
Thanks very much, Liam, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just a note, Mike, I have seen your message in the chat, so I will definitely touch on the GPU session host for you. So thank you very much for that input. So from an Azure Virtual Desktop perspective, I just really want to take us through what are the discussion topics we're going to be looking for the opportunities. What are those drivers? What does that migration process look like? So if we have got currently a on-prem RDS environment, how do we actually approach this project and migrate that environment to a cloud-based VDI environment such as Azure Virtual Desktop? I'll also touch on things like greenfields and brownfields. So do we have a current environment or don't we? And just take you through the various approaches and just things to consider when considering a migration. So some of the discussion points that I will be touching on within this presentation would be around the business drivers and defining those drivers. And those drivers would then push into what our migration process will look like. There is a predefined migration process that has been tested. It is quite a mature process. And although this process I'll be touching on will be generally around RDS, this process can be utilized irrespective of what your underlying VDI technology looks like. So it is quite I suppose, non-product specific migration process that we can apply against any VDI environment. I'll then just take us through what that migration looks like. So I'll get into a bit more detail around the technical aspects of that migration. I'll do a couple of just a screen share within a Azure tenancy just to show you some of the tooling that we use. And then I'll just touch on how do we get that best possible cost point for this. So one of the major benefits that people often talk about around moving to the cloud is being able to manage that cost point without over provisioning or under provisioning and maintaining that cost point. So I'll just take you through some of the things that we need to look at from a cost management perspective as well. But before I jump into the weeds, just probably the first thing around what is Azure Virtual Desktop? So that might have been, or you might have heard of it known as WVD or Windows Virtual Desktop. That was rebranded to what is now today known as Azure Virtual Desktop. And if we compare it between what is known as the legacy tooling, so that's your remote desktop services or RDS for short, we used to have a on-prem environment or a hosted environment where we had to run a Windows Server operating system that was based on Win32 apps. We would then deploy generally a perpetual version of Office and share those licensing across multiple users. And that was all based on the long-term servicing channel. So pretty much up to 2 to 3 years before we start looking at maybe upgrading that environment. Now, with the cloud-based Azure Virtual Desktop environment, we now have that similar capability from the legacy perspective. But now we've also introduced what is known as the Windows 10, Windows 11 enterprise desktop experience. So we are able to provide our end users with an operating system that they're familiar with. We're also able to provide them with the Windows 10 and Windows 11 desktop experience within the VDI environment. So as Liam rightfully mentioned, within a lot of the licensing SKUs, the use rights for the Windows 10 and Windows 11 environment is already included. Business Premium being one of the most popular ones, where we can actually not pay any additional licensing to actually utilize that software within Azure Virtual Desktop. On top of that, we have Microsoft 365 apps, and because this has been built cloud ready, all of the 365 apps such as Outlook and OneDrive Sync, etc., all work natively within this environment. So previously, we had some workarounds within the RDS environment to get things like a Outlook offline files working or OneDrive Sync. All of this natively works within the user profiles now under the AVD Windows 10, Windows 11 desktop experience. And we also do have a semi-annual channel upgrade. So that's every January and every July, you'll start seeing those upgrades happen on your applications.
Craig, with COVID happening and everybody working from home and buying a laptop instead of a thin client or a workstation in their office, and has the fat client approach to computing changed the mix of the way people use AVD? For example, you've used the Windows Server operating system. Now you can use the Windows desktop operating system, and then you can do published apps rather than the whole desktop experience. Has that mix changed anything over the last 5 years?
Yeah, so I think you definitely do, and it's a great question, Rodney. I think you've got a mixture of maybe legacy or maybe a current approach on thin clients where they still require that VDI environment. But the big approach around where people do have laptops or thick clients is really around centralizing access to your data. So if you can picture a 30, 40, 50 user a company where they've all got their laptops, now trying to maintain a client server application between 50 endpoints and the server, you're basically going to be running into quite a lot of more overhead from a support perspective. So centralizing that approach and how people access company data and access company systems to 2, 3, or 4 systems rather than supporting all 50 just provides that better control and gives you that better guardrails with regards to how data is accessed, how data is shared and controlled.
Thanks.
Pleasure. So from a business drivers and goals perspective, these are just some of the things that are coming up quite commonly within the environments that are considering moving to Azure Virtual Desktop. Some of the common drivers would be end of life. So a lot of customers do have either a hosted or an on-prem environment of RDS or Citrix or whatever it may be, and they've reached their end of life, and the decision really being made now is, should we be replacing all of that hardware? Is that the right approach for our company, or what does the alternative look like? So what does a cloud-based VDI environment look like? So that is definitely one of the main driving factors where people are finding their equipment is starting to become out of date or end of life. As I mentioned earlier, the optimization around supporting natively Microsoft 365 apps. So we do have workarounds. Sometimes we don't have workarounds within the legacy environments for 365 apps and all of the features that it has. Whereas we move to a modern approach, we do have native support for all of these modern apps. We also might have a requirement for scaling or performance. So do we foresee our company growing or having certain periods of time that we require more resources than we don't? This will also build into the fact that we don't have to buy a large amount of equipment just for an in case or just for a certain part of our business within 2 to 3 months of the year, for example. Overlapping and lapping those security controls that we have. So using either hybrid identities or cloud-only identities and having those security tools that are being built within the cloud and wrapping those around our environments. And then also flexibility in the resourcing. So scaling up, scaling down, deciding on which resource we want to put in to provide that session host or that VM to our customers.
And now might be a good time to talk through Mike's question. In regards to GPU and utilizing this kind of technology for more expensive end user devices. Tell us what AVD is going to do for that in the current.
Absolutely. So with regards to Azure Virtual Desktop, everything is delivered through what is known as a session host, and it's just a fancy name for a virtual machine. So the underlying compute and resources that's getting provisioned for the users is all basically sitting on a virtual machine. So Microsoft has dedicated VM SKU types for GPUs. So it's basically the NC series, the N series, and they've got either NVIDIA or AMD chipsets, and you are basically able to provide that session host to your end users. Now, you're going to have two options available to you. So if you only have 2 or 3 employees out of your 10 employees that require the large graphics processing, that type of stuff, you can provide them with either a shared environment where all 3 of them are going to share that one VM, or you can do what is known as a personal. So a personal will be a one-to-one, where you'll build this session host or VM for that end user, and that end user will be presented that same VM every single time they log in. So if you're looking for economies of scale and trying to get the best price point, you'd probably look at a shared environment. But there are some companies that like to give that dedicated resource to the users, and we are able to do that from a personal perspective as well. And then second to that is you're going to have a mixture of personas, which I'll touch on later, but you can also then create a separate VM or session host for those general users who don't need high graphic processing and will use the cheaper VM SKUs for that. So all of these get put into what is known as a host pool, and each host pool will then be allocated to the users. So we definitely have that flexibility in the resourcing, and that'll be one of the drivers, as Mike mentioned, around what their drivers and goals are for enabling AVD. So once we've defined those drivers, we have then look at what our goals are. So often a goal is to modernize. So as mentioned, we might want to move off the on-prem to the cloud just to look for those modern capabilities and the modern tooling that we have. As Liam mentioned, we might want to utilize those feature sets that are included in our licensing. We might be running business premium across our organization, and we know that we've got use rights for Windows 10 and Windows 11 Enterprise in there, and it makes sense for us to move to a cloud-based VDI model, improve our security and data controls, and then also optimize and scale as required from a business perspective. So the general migration process looks as follows. So we've defined our drivers and our goals in the previous steps. We understand why we want to move to a cloud-based model. And from those definitions and goals, we know that it makes sense for us. So the next step would be to assess our current environment. So that in current environment would be assessing the compute, the resources. It'll be assessing the users, the software inventory, landscape, etc., and understanding exactly what we need to replicate and provide for our users in the cloud. We're then going to plan and prep that target environment. And what is meant by this is really around making sure that our target environment is ready for landing our resources. So that includes things like user access control. It includes things like best practices and making sure that we have the right alerts. There's a whole approach to the best practices around this, and I'll touch on it again a bit later as well. And then we can also decide on, do we want to do a lift and shift? So in other words, do we want to take our current environment as is, put it into Azure, and present that as the VM for our users? Or are we looking to rather maintain the current on-prem environment, build a new one from greenfields, and then just migrate the data across and then adopt that as basically a cutover migration? Once we've done the assessment and we've got the understanding of exactly what we want to move, how we're going to move it, and where we're going to move it to, we then start the actual process of migrating these. So the migration approach would be either greenfield or brownfield, being brand new greenfields, or brownfields being something that we have in place already and we're just going to build on top of. We're then going to migrate those VMs or deploy the new session hosts, migrate those user profiles. So we might have user profile disks or how the users' profiles are sitting on the current environment, how we're going to get that data off and moved into the new environment. And if we do have any custom images that we utilize within our current environment, do we want to replicate those images in our new Azure Virtual Desktop environment? And if we do, we'll also migrate those across. So once we've got everything across, we look at managing it. So this is where it comes in around making a decision around a published app, which is basically that the user would only be able to see that app, double-click the icon, and only access the app. Or do we want to actually present a full desktop experience to our end users? We can do both, or we can do one. That's really up to us how we want to do it. There is I suppose, a recommended best practice to always lean towards published apps rather than full desktop experience. And again, it's around that overhead of managing and maintaining the environment. And then we're going to do things like setting user access, scale plans, monitoring, etc., that we'd have to do from a management perspective. Once we've done that, we want to optimize this. So this is a continuous optimize and review are both continuous tasks that we do on a regular basis. And we can either automate this with certain tools that are provided via Microsoft, or we can put manually stop gaps in to make sure that we are continuously looking at this. So from an optimization perspective, make sure that we are obviously continuously looking at our security requirements and making sure that only the right people are accessing the right things. Defining what those cost expectations are going to be like. So really important that if we have a understanding that an environment is going to cost us X, that we put budget alerts against that. The reason being is that we want to make sure that halfway through the month, if the budget has already been spent on this environment, that we're going to pick it up early. And it might be a misconfiguration from a VM size, it might be storage, there could be a whole lot of things within the cloud where the costs can exponentially grow, and we want to be made aware of those. ensure we've got the right licensing, and then also once we've got a environment that is up and running and the users are using it, do we have any business continuity or disaster recovery requirements that we need to adhere to? And then we'll have a look at that and make sure that we enable that post the migration. We want to continue to review this. So within Azure, you're going to get a whole lot of insights. You're going to get a whole lot of recommendations as to how to make the environment cheaper from Microsoft. They're going to give you recommendations from a security perspective. If you are using something like Entra ID Plan 2, you are going to be able to automate a lot of the access reviews. So from a user perspective, ensuring that only the right people can access the right things. And as I mentioned, put in those alerts from a cost perspective as well as a security perspective to make sure that you are always covered from an early warning system perspective. So from a migration perspective, there are a couple of things that we want to do before we actually start moving the environments across. So one of the prerequisites, or there's two prerequisites basically, the main one that is always going to be there is you're going to need an Azure subscription. So if you don't currently have an Azure tenancy, that would have to be spun up and that would have to be created. The Azure subscription can certainly be created through PBTech, and they would be able to assist you with professional services as well, should you guys require it. Depending on the way that we're going to manage the user profiles, you could either use a cloud-only identity, or if you're going to be pulling those profiles into what is known as FS Logics profiles, then you would need that to be a hybrid identity. And I'll go through more of that in detail after this. We then move into the assessment. So as I mentioned, we are assessing the entire environment. We are assessing each user's personas. We're assessing the applications that are there. How many concurrent users do we have? So if we know we're running 10 concurrent users between 9 and 5, and then only 1 or 2 concurrent users after that, it really does help knowing that from a cost perspective, because we can scale up and down within the cloud. So we are able to remove any resources that aren't being used and actually turn them off just to get that cost saving. And then we also want the session host performance data. Now, all of this can be done through tools that Microsoft provides for free. And in the next slides, I'll be able to take you in that in more detail. We're going to deploy a baseline. So a baseline really is going to be a landing zone or landing point that we are comfortable with from a networking perspective, a user access perspective, who is going to administer this environment, alerts and recovery. So that'll be disaster recovery as well as operational recovery. So things like backups, etc. Profiles will be, do we want to look at storing those user profiles on the attached VM disks, or are we looking to actually move those off the VMs and into what is known as FS Logics profiles, or aka roaming profiles, where irrespective of which VM the user logs into, they are going to be presented their profiles that they are working with. We'll then migrate. So greenfields only migrate the data, brownfields we migrate in the VM and the data. And then move it into operations, which would mean that we're going to manage the day-to-day operations. And as I mentioned, Azure is going to give you a whole lot of insights into how to better your environment. So those will be the enhancements that we'll make within the migration. So I'm just going to take a quick pause there before we move into the more detailed around the technical migration aspects, and just let hand over back to Rodney for that.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Craig. So just a couple of questions that we've got here. One from Priyak, just regarding the costs. So Priyak, from my perspective, we've got, excuse me. we've always had the opportunity to have shared computing or fat client computing, and we've gone through a few cycles over the last 20 or so years, and the benefits to having shared computing have always been motivated by the same thing. And it's not necessarily about the hardware, it's more about the manageability of the network and the devices and the users. So I think nowadays with AVD, the financial discussion shouldn't be around the hardware and the managing of the hardware, but the management of the users and the management of the data, the management of the security. So if you're hoping to use Azure Virtual Desktop and save money on your hardware, I don't think the finances of it will stack up. If you're hoping to save money by using AVD on the management of your network, of the management of your data, of the management of your users, and giving them consistency no matter where they are in the world or where they are in the country, and making it easy to manage and reduce your management overheads and your security overheads, then there's absolutely an opportunity to save some money there. But if you're going into the AVD equation, hoping that you're going to be able to buy a cheaper computer instead of a more expensive one, there is some arguments with that, like we were talking about with Mike. Instead of you having to buy a $4,000 laptop with a GPU in it, then you can buy a $1,000 device and access your Azure Virtual Desktop with the GPUs included. You can use some of the tools like the FS Logic roaming profiles, so that when you want to log on to your device and do some CAD work, you can choose a more expensive virtual machine to access, and when you don't, when you're just doing admin, you can choose a cheaper one, for example. So there are some tweaks and changes that you can do to the AVD within AVD that enable you to save some money, but effectively you're still going to have a device to access it. Your staff are still going to want a decent device, not a Chromebook or something. So there is not a huge amount of savings that you're going to be able to make from a hardware only perspective. Craig, would you add anything to that?
No, absolutely. Well said. I think it really has moved from the device to the users, and data being key. How are we going to manage that data? How many endpoints do we have to manage that data on? And just trying to centralize and basically provide corridors for our users to be able to safely and securely access the systems that we present to them.
Okay, and just one quick question for you, Liam. And just in terms of space that you get allocated per virtual machine, is that a standard cost included in the subscription?
I might have to get Craig to answer that, because I don't think it's related to the access rights or anything. It's purely from the infrastructure side.
Yep. And last thing before we hand back to Craig, so the next session is going to be more in-depth technically. We'd love you to hang around and have a look at that. We'll show some of the tools that Craig's been talking through. If you need more information in terms of whether the AVD is the right solution for you, would really encourage you to email licensing@pbtech.co.nz. We've got our licensing team and our services team that will work together with you. We've got our consulting team that can come out and work through the decision-making process and have a look at your existing environment to make sure that we make the best decisions for you as a business partner. So again, that access to that is just via licensing@pbtech.co.nz. And we will hand back down to Craig to go through some more technical questions. One of the questions that we've got here, Craig, is just that access to the things that we're all used to these days, which is cameras and microphones and all the things that have been a pain in the neck over previous revisions, and how has that changed? So look, I'll hand back to you for you to share your screen and go on to the next session. If you need to depart us now and we get too technical for you, then would encourage you to just email licensing and we'll come out and have a one-on-one discussion with you as a team.
Yeah, cheers, Rodney. Thanks very much. So yeah, just going through some of the questions here. So Mike, just from before I carry on my share screen, from a GPU VM perspective, from a CAD, I would have to refer to the OEM for this. It would depend on what are they supporting. Are they supporting VMs within Azure? If they are supporting them, we'd be able to definitely present them within the host pool to the users. But we'd definitely have to refer back to the OEMs to make sure that we do have support from them based on the Azure solution. There was another question around the external peripherals. So things like redirect printing, your webcams, everything like that still works as is. It's going to redirect it to your device that you're using. So if those peripherals are sitting on USB or they're sitting on an IP print, whatever it may be, it will be still presented to that session host that the user is connecting to, just as you would find in your traditional RDS environment. So the way that we connect with Azure Virtual Desktop is through I suppose, a enhanced or new version of Remote Desktop. And we've got two options. We've got the web version of it. The web version of it is really utilized for people that really just need to quickly connect to it. Things like redirect on your camera does not work through the web. And then we do have the desktop clients that we install either through the Microsoft Store or through the internet, and that has full capability of all the redirections, etc. Okay. Yeah. Cool. So the next couple of slides are really going to be a little more of a deeper dive around how do we actually start and end this process from a migration perspective. So as I mentioned, we always start with the prerequisites, and those prerequisites is going to be, and always will be, you need an Azure subscription within your available target tenant. All right. Once we have that tenant available to us, we then want to have a look at the assessment. We want to do that assessment of their current environment. Now, Microsoft provides tools to be able to do this free of charge, and they do so through what is known as what the tool is known as Azure Migrate. Now, what Azure Migrate is going to do is it's basically either going to deploy an agent on the host that we're looking to move, or it's going to deploy an appliance on the hypervisor. So basically, if it's VMware or Hyper-V or whatever it may be, we can then deploy the appliance and be able to view all of the guests sitting on there. Now, it's going to collect things like performance data, which we're going to need for sizing. It's going to collect things like application inventories, which we're going to need to make sure that we can support it within the cloud environment. It's also going to do things like concurrent users, how many users are connecting, storage space, storage IOPS, etc. So it's going to do quite a detailed collection of all the telemetry data that we're going to need for us to migrate across. Now, if I may, I'm just going to quickly jump into my environment just to show you what that looks like. So if we have a look at the Azure portal over here, you can see Azure Migrate, and we've got a couple of options around under the migration goals. So we've got servers, databases, and web apps. We've got databases only, and we've got a dedicated VDI and web apps and data box. Now, just a recommendation. We don't have to use the VDI option just because we are looking at moving our VDI environment. Microsoft provides a dedicated VDI option available to us here because they do offer a third-party tool that is chargeable and does have a cost associated with it, and that is known as Lakeside. Now, Lakeside is going to provide you very rich graphics and a lot of detail around the environment and also assist you with migrating it across. But a lot of what this does, or actually all of what Lakeside does, can be achieved with just the free tools that Microsoft provides. So if we have a look at the servers, databases, and web apps option, I've deployed a discovery and assessment already for Azure Migrate. So if we have a look in the assessments, you're going to be able to see the VMs that you have assessed, all right? And it's going to tell you if there is any blockages around moving this VM as is into Azure. So that'll be based on things like your software inventory, what's running on there. If Microsoft picks up something that is known not to run well or not to run at all in Azure, it'll mark it there with not ready. It might be an operating system version. It might be an application that's sitting on top of that. You're going to get ready with conditions, meaning that you might have to upgrade a certain software stack or update an agent or whatever it may be, but it is ready to be able to move. We've just got to fix those conditions before we actually move it. And then it's also going to tell you which ones are ready to move. So ideally, we want to be able to say that all of them are sitting in the green column. and they are ready to be migrated across. It's also going to give you an estimation on the computer cost, so what it's going to cost per month, as well as the storage and what type of disk that it recommends you using. Now, this is all based on the IOPS that it's going to pick up from the telemetry data that it has. It's also going to give you, does it support the OS? So it'll tell you if it's in mainstream, extended, out of support. So keep in mind that if you do have 2012 R2 OSs, that's going to be out of support here, but you can use things like Azure Arc, extended security updates in Azure to be able to support that. So I know that there are a lot of companies out there that are running 2012 R2 within their VDI environments. This is probably the easiest way for you to get those extensions into it, move it into Azure, and then do the modernization afterwards. It's then also going to give you basically what your distribution of your Windows Server looks like across the organization. So it does a really good job of basically collecting all of that information that is required for us to make sure that we have the assessment correct. Okay. Let me just switch back to the deck. Cool. So once we've done the prerequisites, we've also now done the assessment, so we understand exactly what we are working with. We're then going to start looking at the baseline, because now we understand exactly what we want to move and what we want to achieve and what we want to support within the Azure environment. We need to understand, or we need to build this baseline. Now, there's two options available to us over here. If we are dealing with an enterprise size company, or we're looking for that enterprise features to be enabled, Microsoft provides us with a pre-built Azure Virtual Desktop landing zone. All right. Now, the reason why I say enterprise is because if we use this landing zone, which is a single click button that you basically just deploy, it's going to deploy a whole lot of supporting services such as Azure Policy, as storage accounts, login and links, workspace. There's going to be a whole lot of logs it's going to enable, and it's all doing that based on an enterprise landing zone. Now, I have found that a lot of that is overkill when it comes to smaller environments, and sometimes causes quite a lot of I would say headaches that aren't really required, because the environment is not as large as what Microsoft designed that landing zone for. So I say that if you are looking at a smaller opportunity that it might not be enterprise grade, you still need to create a baseline, and that baseline must include things like connectivity. How are we going to connect to this environment? Are we going to do it via the public internet, or are we not? Are we going to do it via a site-to-site VPN or not? Are we going to use ExpressRoute? It's really important we understand how we're going to provide our end users with connectivity to this environment and secure that connectivity. Also things like, as I mentioned earlier, the security around it. What does that baseline and the change management around this environment look like? That is going to be all part of your baseline prior to moving any resource into Azure. So once we've deployed that baseline, we're then going to be looking at the user profiles, because the user profiles can also be either very simple or very complex. So from a simple perspective, if we are going to be running one VM, so in other words, one session host, and all the users are going to be logging onto that VM, then we can quite easily use that VM's disk to host or store all of the user profiles. All right. Now, when you have 2, 3, 4, 5 different session hosts, then the users aren't guaranteed to get that same login VM when they connect, all right? Which means that if we're keeping the profiles on the disk, that user is not going to be able to see what they've been working on or what they've saved and what they've stored. This is where we need to move the user profiles into what is known as FS Logix profiles. Now, again, this is part and parcel of Azure Virtual Desktop. You don't pay extra for this, but there are some requirements around, or prerequisites around, using FS Logix. The first one is it has to be a hybrid identity. What that means is that the identity or the user would have to either come from Active Directory on premises, or you're going to have to deploy a domain controller, a traditional sense domain controller on a VM in Azure, or you're going to use what is known as Entra ID domain services. All right. The reason why we need it to be a hybrid account or a hybrid identity is because FS Logics uses what is known as SMB shares, which is authenticated using Kerberos. Okay. Azure,
Craig, just
yep.
the question there regarding Wayne's got a good question about the management of Intune, of course, managing the end user devices now, end user profiles, pushing apps, removing apps, and managing the application and data of our users on hardware. Can you use those same Intune tools to manage the applications pushed out to Azure Virtual Desktops and machines in the cloud?
Fantastic question. Yes, you can. And the great thing about it is that you can actually set a switch or parameter. So every time you're deploying a new session host or VM, you can automatically join that to Intune, and you're able to manage it through all of your profiles that you have or your policies that you have within Intune. So absolutely, you can.
That's great. And we might be skipping ahead here, but Rob's got a great question just regarding some of the other reporting and the tools that Citrix always is given. Is the AVD reporting and visualizations as good as Citrix? How do we work that?
So full transparency, I'm certainly not a Citrix expert. I've seen some of the reports, but I wouldn't know how robust or rich they are compared to AVD. Because Azure uses log analytics workspaces, we are able to pull that into things like Power BI. We're able to pull them into workbooks, etc. So the richness is all around just pulling that data in. So definitely there is a massive amount of richness from the reporting that we can pull. But comparing to Citrix, I wouldn't have the answer, unfortunately. But yes, from an AVD perspective or Azure perspective, you can certainly pull rich reporting.
Rob, we have to get one of our Citrix gurus to come out and
do a comparison.
we can have a little fight and see how we come out.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. So yeah, just from a user profile perspective, really important that we understand that if we have a single session host, it's okay to use just that VM for the storage. If you have multiple, FS Logics is going to be the way to go for that. And just make sure that you understand that there are those prerequisites of that hybrid identity. It's key to getting those profiles working correctly. So now we've got the baseline, we've got the user profile set up. We know exactly how we're going to be delivering the user profiles to the end users when they log in. We're now ready to migrate. All right. And again, we're going to utilize Azure Migrate to do this. And this is the great thing about Azure Migrate is it's basically a single tool and it's an end-to-end solution. So it's not like we have to move around different tooling to collect data, to move data, etc. Azure Migrate, once we've collected everything, we are able to single-click, replicate, and it will move that entire VM from your on-premise environment into Azure. And by doing so, it utilizes what is known as Azure Site Recovery. So it's basically using Microsoft disaster recovery tool that it utilizes live in enterprise environments to do a failover. It's utilizing that same tool to then just migrate that VM from on-prem into the cloud environment. Now I'll quickly show you what that looks like. So from the Azure Migrate again, so here we've done the discovery and assessment. Once we've done that, we can then be able to do a migration and a modernization, and it's as simply as clicking replicate, telling it where to replicate to, and off it goes and replicates that VM across for you. So once we have the VM migrated, or we've created new VMs, depending on if we're using brownfields or greenfields, we then basically just going to be moving into the testing phase. The testing phase is going to be for us to enable 1 or 2 users, make sure that it's working correctly. And once it's working, we'll then go live with that and move it into an operational or management phase where we start just basically supporting it and making sure that we continuously optimize it. So from a cost management perspective, so earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that we want to try and get that perfect price point for these environments. All right. And with that, Microsoft has provided quite a lot of nice tools for us to be able to utilize to try and keep that cost down as much as possible. So the first one being what is known as Start VM on Connect. All right, so now that we know that all of the infrastructure, underlying infrastructure on AVD is basically a VM that is presented to the users, we don't want to be utilizing these VMs when there is no one logged into them. All right, and this is where Start VM on Connect is a super useful tool for us to maintain those decreased costs. So what it does is it basically says that we're going to allow, and you can set which users are allowed to do this, but we're going to allow user A, B, and C to be able to power up the environment. All right. So let's take, for example, that we have VMs running in the environment, and we know that the company closes at 6 p.m. in the evening. We can then turn those VMs off because no one's using them. But now the director might want to do something within the environment at 9, 10 p.m. in the evening. That director is able to start up that VM to be able to utilize it. All right, so that as soon as that director tries to connect, it'll basically just say, please hold while we ramping up the environment. It'll power up that VM, and that director would then get access to that environment. So really cool way to still be able to allow the users to access the environment, even though the environment is turned off. Secondly, we've got scaling plans. So we ramp up and ramp down. Basically what this is if we understand exactly what times things are getting busy. And again, we can utilize the logs, etc., to build nice dashboards to see what our busy periods are. But we'll basically ramp up. So let's say that we have 4 session hosts or 4 VMs. Ramp up, there'll be 1 VM available between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. And then as soon as that VM hits 60% usage, we would then ramp up the second, the third, the fourth. And similarly with ramp down, as soon as we start getting to the quiet period where people start going home, we'll be able to turn off that 4th one, 3rd one, 2nd one until we have either one running or nothing running at all. To automate the startup and shutdown, so if we have specific times that we want to start up this environment and shut down, we've got runbooks available to us. So we're able to fire it up and fire it down. Alerts. So from a cost management perspective, again, like I mentioned, we want to create budgets and we want to create alerts against those budgets. So if we're reaching 60, 70, 80, 90% of our estimated or expected budget, we want to be made aware of that as early as possible. And lastly, the Azure Calculator. So the Azure Calculator from an AVD perspective does a really good job of taking into account concurrent users, taking into account the amount of hours you're going to be running it, as well as doing reserved instances or savings plan, etc. So you can utilize that calculator to get a good estimate as to what this environment is going to cost you. So the Azure Virtual Desktop, and I've spoken a lot about it being moved from an RDS environment, but Azure Virtual Desktop's underlying capability, so from a infrastructure perspective, it can certainly work with third-party control planes. So Citrix is one of those where we are able to basically deploy or maintain or use a Citrix control plane, but in the back end actually utilize the infrastructure that Azure can provide. All right. So the Citrix Desktop as a Service in Azure, it's called Virtual Apps and Desktop Standard. But basically what it is it's going to link the Azure underlying infrastructure with your Citrix management plane. All right. So what this does is Microsoft will provide the infrastructure, so the compute, the storage, the network, and then the Citrix control plane will be basically the management layer. All right, so you're going to be able to deploy VMs or session hosts from your Citrix management plane. You're going to be able to delete different users or add users. So your full management capability still stays within your Citrix plane, but the underlying infrastructure or the hardware that's going to be providing those services will be running in Azure. Last thing from our side really is Liam touched on the Azure Virtual Desktop external users. So what this basically is a hosted environment type style. So if you wanted to create, or you created a Azure Virtual Desktop environment within your Azure tenancy, but you had 2 or 3 companies that wanted to utilize or needed to utilize the systems that you're hosting in there, but that don't work for your company, you can provide them access to that environment using the external users licensing portion. All right. So these are not internal users. These are users that don't work for you and need to access the systems that you are presenting through your AVD environment. So there's 2 price tiers for this. The first one is if that user is only going to be accessing a remote app, then you would use the price tier 1. Or if that user is going to be using either a remote app or being presented with an option of using a desktop experience, then you'd have to use the price tier 2, which is apps and desktop. All right, so there's 2 options there, depending on how you're going to present the access for that external user that you will be providing for. And with that, guys, that is really what I wanted to share with you. So I hope that was beneficial to you, and I hope that the information shared there was something that you can take away and assist with your journey to the VDI environments.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Craig. Wayne had a quick question there around accessing your AVD, whether you need a VPN or you can do it through the direct internet. Wayne, the answer to that is that's a part of the sort of staging, the setup of it. You can choose either or. And I'm assuming, Wayne, there had the question about whether you can access on-prem data through your Azure Virtual Desktop. I imagine that the answer to that is yes, you can, but it may be dog slow because you're going to have to be taking data back to the Azure environment. Craig, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, sure. So really also great question. So the services can certainly be accessed via the internet. So one of the big differences from a security perspective really is that AVD doesn't use traditional 3389 to access. It's all done through 443. So you are able to access it securely on the internet. But if you wanted to access on-prem data from the session host, you would then be able to have to set up something like a site-to-site VPN or express route, so you can have that line of sight between the 2 environments. But yes, certainly you can access it via the internet as well.
Very good. Victor, you had one question before we wrap up.
Yep, I just wanted to say, just for the sake of people that wanted to try perhaps AVD, Craig, I don't know if that's something that's possible, but Graham had a question. If he wants to stand up a single remote user on AVD, would he use AVD versus using a Windows 365 cloud PC that you can buy, the pretty much a reserved instance through the NCE plan?
Yeah. Great question as well. If you've got a single user, I would certainly lean towards Windows 365 Cloud PC. I believe that an AVD environment may be a little bit of an overkill for that. But again, it also depends on does the company foresee growth? Does the company foresee new hiring and new users or employees coming on? So if you want to try and start planning around that, have those discussions and see, well, okay, if you've only got one user that really needs a cloud PC, then use the Windows 365 environment. It's fantastic. It really is. But if you're looking at 2, 3, 4, 5 and looking at growth, then AVD is definitely the right way to do that. You've also got way more control around the AVD environment than you do around Windows 365. Windows 365 also can be added to Intune to be able to be managed through that as well.
Excellent. Right. Well, I'm very pleased to tell you that PBTech's customers are all very, very greedy. We have Mike and Sam here insisting that everybody on the call get a free tablet. I can tell you, Mike and Sam, that if you engage PBTech services to consult with you around migrating you to AVD, and we'll send out a technician, consultant, and we'll plan the whole migration for you and give you a massive big bill and a Samsung Galaxy tablet. So there you go. That's the way that you can win one.